Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our final session of the day. We wanted to make sure to build in some time during the program that was dedicated to only questions. You can submit those through the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we'll go ahead and unmute you so you can ask your question directly. But before we start, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, even though they've already presented throughout the symposium. But David, you are first on my list on the screen, so go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, hopefully connection is all right. Thanks, Ruby, and nice to see everybody. And I have caught a few of my co-panelists' presentations, so that's good. If you missed my presentation earlier, I'm a faculty member at the Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, and also affiliated with our College of Information Studies. And I've actually been working in the area of digital preservation of at-risk digital business records since the maybe late 90s. When I was interested in .com companies, and I've been focusing on email, or in particular organizational email, in hopes that we can use those kinds of records to answer new types of questions in organization and business history. Our project here with the EABCC group has been on a context discovery tool for kind of exploring email collections when you don't know what's in them.
Thank you so much, David. And you make a good point that I forgot to include, that all these panelists are EABCC awardees. So thanks for bringing that up. We'll go on next to Nick.
Thank you, Ruby. So I'm Nick Canizzo. I am a digital archivist at Norwich University here in Northfield, Vermont. I'm also the project manager for the Council of State Archivists Prepare grant project, and some other grant projects for them as well, mostly looking at improving the digital preservation capacity and capability of the enterprise of state territorial government. So 50 states, 5 territories, and District of Columbia. And we're talking about digital preservation of email in this particular context. And that's one of our kind of biggest sets of records, obviously. And there's a lot of scrutiny on public records that are contained in email. But really talking about all kinds of electronic or digital data, just really throughout government. So that's why we're here. And that's what we're going to continue to investigate and try to improve. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Nick. And last but not least, Greg.
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Wiedemann. I'm the University Archivist at UAlbany, and I was the project director of the Mailbag project, which was an EABCC awardee, and we created a specification and a command line tool for managing email using multiple different formats.
Thank you. Now we'll go ahead and accept any questions. I know Chris put in the chat that you can raise your hand and ask them directly. We don't mind that. You can also go ahead and do the Q&A if that is your preference. And I just have a general question kind of related to email archiving, but not related to email archiving. I know that some of you have been attending the sessions. How have you been liking the symposium? Anybody can answer that one.
That's amazing. You know, you guys have done it. I mean, look at all you've done. You know, chapeau. I mean, it's really, really impressive. And a nice range of conversations. You know, it's a non-trivial accomplishment to get a slug of money from Mellon and, you know, spread it out this way. In my view. And I'm obviously biased because we got a little bit of it, but it's not the money that's made the difference. It's I think there's a real community building. And I think, you know, I for one, am really looking forward to what, you know, what Ruby, you and Chris write, that we learn from all this. So that I think, putting the wrapper around this, this is gonna advance the ball a long way, I think.
Yeah, that's going to be our next step.
Yeah, I found it really helpful, and it also feels in some archivists and archives you talk to, like not everyone has email, so it kind of feels like a niche thing, or not managing email yet, probably. But it's also great to see so many people in one place, to see that a lot of different people in a lot of different organizations are handling these problems. So it's great to have everyone together and to have these discussions.
One thing that we found a lot during our work was that people are looking for best practices, but there isn't just one best practice. There isn't just one tool to use. There isn't just one workflow or process. And I think that this symposium over the last 2 days and tomorrow as well, just the slate has demonstrated how many new tools there are out there and how they could be used. Even the commenters in the chat have provided a lot of good examples of kind of novel ways to approach these problems, and that's what it's all about, right?
Right. And I mean, I think if I can just chime in here a little bit myself, I've been struck by the way that we're making a few connections that I didn't expect to make between different communities. So to take the talk we just had about the attachment converter, you have a tool that's relatively early in its development, but can plug in potentially in a place to other tools where there's a definite need that's been known for quite a bit of time. But as part of that, it was also interesting to me, when Tim Gollins jumped in at the end to say, hey, have you guys all thought about Droid here? Because a little light bulb went off in my head and said, that's a really good point. And why didn't I think of that earlier? Because as part of the digital preservation community, I've known about Droid for a really, really long time. And it just kind of becomes part of the world you live in without thinking about potential applicability to other projects. So I've been kind of gratified to see those sort of, third connections, sort of, 6 degrees of 7 Kevin Bacon connections kind of being made there. So do we have any questions yet from the audience here, from the attendees? Otherwise, I'm going to have to jump in with one of my questions.
We just got one. So it's from Aaron O'Malley. My question is, how do I even start incorporating email archiving into our existing digital policies?
Nick, I think that might be over.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not sure if you can tell, but we're all looking at you.
Yeah, so sure. It's one thing I would say that we often think about in certainly government, but I think about it a lot in my life as an academic archivist as well, is what our collections development policy is. In government, we don't really have collections development. Most of what we preserve and save is statutorily mandated. There are classifications for what information and data needs to be retained for certain periods of time. And in some states, the statutes that require us to preserve them literally say that right in the Constitution, right? They say it's incontrovertible. But I think you want to ask yourself, why are you doing it first? What are you doing it for? What are you collecting? How are you collecting it? Because what your final output product is going to look like is going to determine a lot about what you need to do to get it there, where you're sourcing it from, what digital preservation actions you're taking on your set of records, how you're contextualizing it, and so on. So I would look to your audience first and figure out what are they looking for, or how do you anticipate what their needs are related to email? That would be a first place I would start.
It looks like we have another question from Kim. I'm going to allow you to talk. You should be able to unmute now. I see that you're unmuted, but we can't hear any audio. While we wait for Kim, there is another question One thing I've wondered about, maybe some of the panelists know, are Google email labels preserved in Inbox? And can they be utilized when re-imported into a third-party client? Also, as far as I know, you can only export email from Gmail and not re-import. Is that still correct? So that was like 3 questions. So let me know if you want me to repeat one of them. You could also take a look at the Q&A too.
I think I know the answer to this because
Okay.
we kind of encountered this working on our project. And yes, they are in the Mbox files that it exports, but they are not standard headers. So to my knowledge, most or none of the clients or other software that I know reads them. Even the folder structure, which is what we were really looking into, is that there's really not a common way to, because we were converting like PST files to other formats to document that folder structure, which can be really important. So Outlook and Gmail use different headers to document that information. So they don't read each other's export formats. So it's in the text file and software can read it and parse it theoretically, but I don't think anything really does it out of the box. For example, for Mailbag, we handle the X folder header, which is the one that the majority that we could find use and Outlook uses, but Gmail uses like X Google or X Gmail folder or something like that I don't remember, and we ended up not able to implement that. So that's an open issue still that we hope to in the future. So hope that answers your question.
So it sounds like, Greg, in a lot of cases, the headers are passed through as they are export from Google, or Microsoft, but because they're part of the extensible headers, most email systems, aside from those they originated from, really can't do anything with them. So they're there for preservation and evidential value, but beyond that, use is dicey.
Yeah, you could use it if you are like scripting or writing code with it, but yes, there's not really out of the box tools necessarily.
Round 3 of the grants.
I keep telling Chris.
I'll have to put that into a hopper for consideration. But a lot else on my agenda at the moment. But since this is great to see the results of the project, I have to confess, after as Ruby indicated in your opening remarks, lots of learning about grant management processes on our end to see so many well-run projects really has been heartening. I see Kim has put their question now in chat. So just reading here. Looks like it's a thank you more than anything else. It's spurred me to start collecting, even though we do not have the capacity to do much more than that right now. We at least will have the email folders. Thank you for getting us started.
Yeah, well, and my experience with this community is that it's very collaborative, and your emails will be responded to. So reach out.
Okay, it looks like we just got another question. I work as a digital archivist at a small private archive, and this year processing our email archive is one of our top priorities. Similar to Catherine Antonelli, I am the first digital archivist for the organization, so I'm navigating uncharted waters. Could you provide general advice on how to get started? I'm particularly interested in hearing from experienced individuals who can share insights and lessons they wish they had known before stepping into this type of work.
Anyone care to take that one on? I have a couple of thoughts here, but I'm going to let somebody else go first.
I mean, I think this also piggybacks on, I think we might have lost Nick, but Nick's answer previously that really kind of try to drill down to like why and what the mission and the principles of what you're trying to do with the email first. And then just my approach would be to get it stable and something that's like that you can use in the future and have actual control over after you decide what actually you want to collect. yeah, and that's also more of can be more of an organizational challenge, or it could be more of a technology challenge, just depending on what you have already and what you can't need access to.
Yeah, and I would say, I think my answer used to be imagine the user. And now my answer would be find the user and talk to them. Because that's going to really be a huge, that's going to shape a lot of what you try and do and how you try and do it.
Here's another question. If in case this hasn't been addressed, what are your thoughts about long-term sustainability of your projects? And this technically has not been addressed. I don't think so anyways. But I feel like anybody could answer this question because you all have very different range of projects going on.
Yeah, for us, I mean, I think this is a major concern, because with any grant project, like the funding ends, like, and then you don't necessarily have resources behind continuing that work. So in our project in particular, Mailbag, we kind of, the nature of it is kind of a little bit built in, is that the specification is very easy to maintain. It's just a document, and all it is a structure on a file system. So that part of it, I think I'm confident will live on, even if the tool in long term has, like, if we don't sustain it for whatever reason. So even if you use, as long as you have a Mailbag, you should be able to access it in the long term future, just because it's built on like common standards that Baggett and file systems, which are really widely used. For the tool wise, most of the things I think are pretty sustainable. Most of the day-to-day and making sure everything is able to use is like dealing with like Python updates and like random updates that are not that labor intensive. The bigger question, I think, is around PST parsing in particular, because that's our one dependency pipeline that's really risky, because there's just not that many open tools, because it's a proprietary format. Open tools that we can work on that parses PST files. Yeah, so I think that's the biggest risk. And the other risk is generally the like method that we're using. We're relying a lot on email export files throughout this symposium that we've talked on about mboxes and PSTs. And Gmail still exports mboxes, and you can get PSTs out of Microsoft, but in the future, I don't know if companies are necessarily incentivized to prioritize like export formats. Like we might end up in a couple of years from down the road, the best path for capturing email might be over APIs, which proposes lots and lots of risks because they are proprietary and things like that. So there are long-term risks from that perspective as well.
Yeah, as well as, sort of what is the kind of state of the data that you're getting over an API. It's a very different kind of process that there's vulnerabilities when materials are being transmitted in that way. So yeah, I think there's all sorts of the long-term problem is still, we're just going to have to sail into the unknown on that one.
See, my reaction to the question about long-term sustainability is, what do you mean by long-term? How long are we talking? With our project specifically, the goal was and continues to be to build capacity at institutions that, we're talking about state and territorial archives. These are public institutions that have sustainability as kind of a core program function. So we believe that if we can build up their capacity and make their capability, that they can take care of a lot of that themselves. However, we can't future-proof against technology forever. I think when Greg was talking, I think I was just thinking to myself, like, Microsoft could change the PSD specification literally anytime they want, and what can we do about it? Not necessarily anything. So, to some degree, we're always going to be following behind whatever the state of the art is. But I think a part of our job is to get as close behind as we possibly can. And maybe even some days be able to get so close behind them that we can see ahead and see what's coming in a way that, there's no curveball or winger that just comes our way. And it's, how do I deal with this? How do you save my Discord DMs or something, like things like that. Who knows what communications platforms people will be using 5 years from now. I think people have said email was going to die for 2 decades now, and they'll probably be saying it for 2 more decades, right? So, I think part of the question is just going to be, how long do we go down this path until we hand the baton to the next group that's going to figure out the next set of technologies or how to kind of migrate to those.
Yeah, I think,
Go ahead.
no, right. I was just gonna build a little bit on what all of you are saying. To go back to some of the discussions I had with Don Waters, who was the program officer at the time we were putting the initial, parent grant application together. There was a real desire to move the existing tooling and move the community a little bit further in the direction of long-term sustainability. But that's perhaps less around specific tools and more around a community of practice that works with and converts email into formats that are supportable for the long term. So that in that sense, the project, I think, has made some really important steps forward to thinking about your project, Greg, having a stable format for packaging email using an existing standard from another community that's widely used, for email. That's a big step in the right direction. Or building preservation functionality into ePad. That's a step in the right direction. To take any of the other projects out there, being able to offer a way to convert attachments and move them back into an MBOX file so that they can be moved, into a preservation repository with a converted version or a migrated file. That's a step. But given the size of the community, we're not going to coalesce around one tool and have, a service model that supports those tools. From other projects I've been involved with, we all know that over time, technical debt and other types of debt accrue around tools, and that's a normal expected thing. But when you're dealing with preservation formats and you have things that can be put into repositories, that's a form of sustainability that's more important than any individual tool.
And I just think it's also worth remembering the scale of the challenge, right? That this is, I forget the estimate I saw, 5 billion email accounts. And, the scale, even if it's a few hundred of us who are working on this problem, and maybe then, influencing a few thousand, this is it's a big issue that we're going to have to be kind of figuring out, where to focus and, how to triage and how to figure out what really matters. That's a conversation that's going to be ongoing for some time.
All right, and I see we have another question from Aaron O'Malley in the chat, which perhaps opens up another can of worms a little bit. But given we're talking about email here, how do we see these kinds of workflows or methodologies working for other things like social media platforms, workplace collaboration systems like Slack and Teams, et cetera? I have to confess that's an area where, given everything else I haven't been working on, I haven't been working on that area, but do others of you have knowledge? Those are pretty tricky issues, because in a lot of cases you're dealing with something proprietary, whereas of course email is an inherently open system or open standard-based system.
I can kind of jump in and talk about maybe the state and territorial government perspective on all this. I mean, we know one of the part of our survey and prepare, you can see this in our phase 1 report, is we did ask about other means of electronic communications just to see what was out there. We looked at Slack and Teams and Facebook Messenger and a bunch of different options that we know that public agencies at all levels, from the federal government down to the municipal government, might be using. And I think that a lot of it comes down to thinking about the way that your data is structured, where it's stored and what it looks like. One of the most enlightening things for me and kind of my learning about email specifically was looking at some of the stuff that the Smithsonian did and kind of converting email messages into XML generally, right? We're really just talking about one way to represent data that it might be different than the way that the end user actually sees it, right? You click an email and it opens up and it kind of looks like a separate file. It doesn't necessarily look like that behind the scenes. And Chris's point is really prescient about proprietary technology. So many of these new tools, they're living on servers and they're living in platforms that we have very little insight into how they work, what that data looks like, how it's stored behind the scenes, and we only kind of get these breadcrumbs that they give us and say, oh yeah, we'll let you export that in inbox format, no problem. What am I losing though? What's not actually included in that export? And you would think that even with the resources of these giant contracts that states have with Microsoft and Google and those technology corporations, it's still hard to kind of move them towards providing us all the tools that we need to be able to save data appropriately.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. And the thing that correlates, I think, with email is like the tendency of tools generally to get more and more closed off and less open. That makes our work a lot harder and poses more risks as these tools are more closed off than email. And the other thing is that I think why it's a good question is that it's a similar form to email. It's just communication. I think focusing on form over format is a really useful thing. Both as an archival principle, because that's oftentimes what your user really cares about, is like the actual form and not the format. So I think from a policy perspective, it fits into email in many cases pretty well, just because it has that same form.
Yeah, certainly from a FOIA perspective, I think the vast majority of users want to know what the content is and maybe don't care how it's presented, other than, important caveat, how usable it is for what they're doing, right? For what they're looking for. So, it doesn't help to provide somebody with a PSD if they can't actually open a PSD, right? So yeah, there is some necessity there to thinking about format, but yeah, it's just, we think about, certainly at scale, we think about the content structure more so than maybe what any specific implementation looks like.
Yeah, and I might just add that I think, in a way, that I think early on, email was seen as an alternative mode of communication, right? It was how you got around sending a letter or some other more formal way. And there's some legal history about when does email start to count as an official legal communication. That is, well, I have an email that says, we have a contract established by email. So, I think a lot of these systems are kind of evolve from the informal and then formalize over time. So it's quite reasonable that someone might submit a FOIA request for a Slack channel or other form of, some of these informal communications. And then all of a sudden, we're all going to have to answer, well, how do we produce that? How do we respond to that? How do we understand what was going on there? So, I think we, in a way, maybe this is a pitch, Chris, for the final report to take a little bit of a historical perspective on this. But we've watched email evolve over time, so maybe there's some things we can learn from how email has evolved too. to these other, more recent kind of platforms. Notwithstanding the proprietary issues, which are very serious. If there are no other questions, Chris, can we pepper you with questions?
You can try. I don't know if I'll be able to answer them.
I mean, I know it's, long end of the second day and you've got another whole day to come.
Right,
But-
I have my own talk tomorrow, which I have to finish getting ready for.
Well, we don't want you to spill any beans.
No, I won't. No, I'm happy to try anyway.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, where do you see kind of this community going next? You've been really a kind of linchpin for all these hundreds of people.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'll try to reflect a little bit on this in whatever closing remarks I make tomorrow, which will be
Yeah,
relatively.
then don't give it away. But if there's anything if you want to test drive anything with us.
No, that's always good. I mean, I think one thing I think to look at pretty carefully, or an area perhaps for the community to focus some attention, is specifically around the use of email collections and demonstrating uses of them, or linking projects together in a way that resonates outside of the community itself and more with the general library community, or even the general public. That's one thing I really like about the, to highlight the COVID-19 project in particular, is this is something where there's likely to be a lot of inherent interest in it. I mean, people kind of have this natural tendency to want to see what other people are writing about in private, right? And COVID-19 is something that affected all of our lives in such a terrible sort of way. So there's a natural interest in it, in that project, and I think other ones where there's some key public interest at work. So I'm not totally sure where I'm going with that yet, but I think anything that makes apparent the value of email archives to specific user communities is good and valuable, because that brings us a little bit closer to a point where there's more support for archiving email, and potentially more resource allocation toward it as well. So anyway, that's one thing that occurs to me. I know foundations, not that I'm planning to submit another grant application to the Mellon Foundation, nor have I been invited to, but foundations do like to see immediate results and direct connections over to user communities. I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Well, I think there is this, I remember when I sort of got into this business, there was this idea that digital was going to be cheaper, that we were going to save a bunch of money by having everything digital. And it's just such how quaint,
You may save it on the storage side, but you don't save it on the preparation and the processing side.
Right, of course. Or God help you trying to find something.
Yeah, well, that doesn't even get into all of the the environmental costs of using spinning disk storage and all of those things that we should be concerned, but we are concerned about as well. So,
well, in a way, there's a sustainability question there too. I know when a lot of the governments kind of moved from their physical correspondence, their physical file rooms, to now their digital servers and the digital storage space, it became a kind of a out of sight, out of mind kind of problem. Like, it's no, in government at least, the best time for collecting records or for getting them transferred to you is because the file room's full, or there is some other storage based or operational based necessity. The cheaper that storage gets, quote unquote cheaper, there becomes less desire to do that. So we want to make it sure that transferring stuff to the archives is seamless and easy and no loss of functionality. Otherwise, it's hard to motivate our record producers to be able to do that. That's problem is getting worse, not better. It's it's really the number of times I've heard a CIO say, "Well, the storage space is cheap." That's not music to my ears.
Right. No, that tends to be every problem looks like it needs a hammer kind of answer there. So
I actually have a question for the group, if I might. It's just thinking about Chris talking about the user communities. I'm curious if you guys from your academic experience, we know our users from the kind of the public side of things how are academic researchers interacting with email collections? Are you guys, and this would be a question for the community as well, are people creating finding aids for email collections? Are you providing individual emails? Are you providing entire sets of emails? You're providing multiple mailboxes at a time? Like how, we saw some examples today, but I'm curious how others are doing it. I want to know what people feel their best practices are.
Yeah, I mean, one of our project actually came about my kind of struggles to process our like all faculty staff listservs. So now we have the tool to do it, and we have it collected, but we actually haven't processed it and made it available yet. We haven't got back to it, but the plan is to package it and using Mailbag it and provide access via PDFs and via our digital repository, and then describe those collections in using finding aid metadata essentially. But we're hoping to build like access systems in generally that make finding aids like more accessible and user friendly, so we can describe at multiple levels of detail. So you don't actually have to like have item level metadata for each email necessarily. Just like you had in a traditional archival collection, you can have some description for large quantities of materials or individual materials, depending on what value and what resources you have.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That finding aid was a particularly constrained sort of genre, if you will, and so I think we have a lot of creativity now around how we describe the contents of our of these collections. But I think, at least in my little corner of academia, I think people are still sort of struggling with what to use it for and how to use it. So this was an idea that I kind of threw out earlier about, kind of systematicity. Like, how do you think about how well systematized the collection is? If you think of kind of 1,000 found emails that were stolen from, somebody, or a 4 million email data dump from the Panama Papers, or a well kind of processed and kind of well curated collection. Kind of what kinds of questions can we ask with those different types of artifacts? And I think my colleagues are still sort of coming to terms with that, if you will, that spectrum of material.
And I think also as archivists, we don't necessarily document that too well. Like, that's part of our principles, and I think we know how to do that pretty well with paper collections. But I think our standards, and DAX being the big one that I keep going to, is that tells us we should focus on that intellectual context to all this information and try to maintain it and expose it to users. But I think that's really, there's a lot of barriers to doing that with like an email collection today. That's a little hard to work on, that we need to focus more on.
Yeah. And, for me, I'm only really able to access collections of failed companies. So we got a problem there. For hundreds of years, we study the successes. And now here we are having to somehow learn from the failures, because they're the ones who lost the capability to destroy the resource. So yeah, that's also a problem, convincing some of these, big, I mean, we should be careful what we wish for. If Google were to actually say, oh, here, Chris, take Gmail, please. Take a copy. It's we wouldn't know, we wouldn't have a data center big enough to hold it. But I think there are some, at least from in my world, thinking about, private for-profit companies tend not to just hand over their email because there's a possible risk, not because they can tell me what the risk is, but because they can't tell me there's no risk. And so from a fiduciary perspective, maybe they're doing the right thing, but we may lose a lot of, we may not be able to answer the kinds of questions that we have going forward. So yeah, I think there's still some work to be done.
Yeah, I kind of have less hope in that era. Like, I think it's really hard to get private. Most of the paper collections that we have from decades past, I think some of them would never have come to us in the modern, sense of legal risk around correspondence. But I think here is where public records really help us. And I think we need to further policies. In New York, for example, it's very easy to obfuscate FOIL requests. You can delay and say you can't find it, and there's basically no real consequences to that. There needs to be real consequences for, at least on the public side, for when we're actually paying for it as the public, that we should be able to find documentation and it should be made public. And we need to have some teeth into those.
Yeah, one thing we always talk about at among the public archive community is that a lot of these issues are the consequence of poor governance or poor records management in a way that might not be explicitly poor, right? I mean, we may not be obviously doing something wrong, but it's really apathy is not the right word, but it's just the lack of action being taken. And we talked about this in I think both of our talks, about how we're just shocked at the number of government employees who use their email for personal things. Just all of them, just every single one. And, you question why. And, if it makes a lot of sense in 1993, when maybe you're working for the state or the federal government, and that's the only email account you have because you don't have a personal one, and they give you one when you show up, and well, that's cool, you have it. But in 2021, I mean, come on. we know that, even public officials have private email servers and they're not supposed to, but yet people still put all this personal information in it. So, it really starts for us at the top, that records creation process, and what is that individual producer doing? How are they actually using their email? And we said this a million times, people use it for a lot of activities, especially in government, that they're not supposed to be using it for, or they shouldn't be using it for. Or we would run screaming away as records managers to learn that they were doing this, but it's just what they've done, and it's just kind of how it was built over time. And we have to remember that they didn't flip on the switch and have 2023 Microsoft SharePoint and Exchange and 365 online. They built it over the course of 10 different iterations, kind of preserving some of that legacy each time in the migration. And so now we have 10 different versions to worry about as a legacy issue because we haven't dealt with it. So Archivist talking about backlog, so here we are again, but it's going to continue until we get our arms around that initial governance. And part of what we've observed is that every time we try to implement it, it's just way too complicated. Even a single sentence like put your email into folders by X, that's almost too much. You kind of need to make the folders for them and tell them exactly where it goes and pre-program the rules into the system so that when certain keywords come up or when certain recipients, you get messages from them, it automatically gets filtered and routed to the right place. But at the end of the day, it's still always going to be this kind of manual patchwork of a bunch of different tools and processes that we're using to make this all fit together.
We talk about technical debt, but there's a type of institutional debt in terms of learning and I have to say, if I go a day without attending to my email, it feels like, I feel like I'm rowing a leaky boat, and it's filling up, it's filling up, it's filling up. And if I don't spend an hour or so a day just bailing, I'm drowning. And so I think that's something wrong with I don't know, with the basic system. There's something, anyway, I'm sorry, it's late in the day. I'm getting a little cranky, but but I think we have to think about what we're asking people to do, what's reasonable. And in some level, I have some of these old collections from these email collections I have from the late 90s are marvelous because people made no effort to separate personal from the professional. And so they tell it's like a golden age of epistolary culture where people are just writing what they actually think and what they, on the one hand, that's marvelous. On the other hand, that's a nightmare for a records manager.
They may be the ones to look for because they're getting old and they're getting long enough in the tooth now that they may benefit from some of the things that our print archives did over the years when they came many years later. But I want to thank you all. I think we're at the end of our time here. So Ruby, would you be able to tell us a little bit more about tomorrow morning and wrap us up for the day?
Yep, we just hope that you'll come back and join us for our final day. It's a little bit shorter tomorrow, but we still have a packed full agenda, and we hope that you come back. Thank you, David, Greg, and Nick. Yep.
For those who are up early or late, depending where you are. So thanks again, everyone. Hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Thanks, everybody.